So the organising committee begins by regretting that no member of the Labor Party could find the time to come to this event today. We do have a letter from the Planning Minister, Dick Wynne, which I'll read out to you later. What else do I have to do? Now, each speaker will have 5 minutes at the very beginning. We have a bell. Could we hear the bell, please? Oh, wow. That said the blood rushing, didn't it? So at 4 minutes, our speakers will get a 1 minute notice, and at 5 minutes, we bring out Big Ben, and you have to stop then. Also, Mr. David Davis, who is still parking his car, so we'll ask him a question about parking later. But he represents two significant portfolios that are part of our discussion today, so he will have an opportunity to speak twice in relation to each of those portfolios. Following the panel discussion, we will have questions. It's been decided that we'll do it a little bit like Q&A, and you would have been at some stage asked if you'd like to present a question. You'll see that we have quite a lot of questions, but they will be asked by me on behalf of those people who submitted a question, and we hope that that will allow more time to get to more of the issues that we would like to touch on today. The event will be filmed. We have, I don't know where they are, anyway, there's cameras somewhere. So if you have an issue with being filmed, please notify us and we'll give you a paper bag to put over your head. We will ask as well for donations. At the end there will be a couple of people with buckets by the exit door. The event today is unbelievably has cost $700 to make happen, and currently I think the organisers are in deficit by about $450. So anything you can do to help them out would be very, very welcome. So I'd like to begin by introducing to you Professor Michael Buxton. Has anybody not been to an event where Michael has spoken? No, we all know who he is. Oh, you. Well, now you can tick that one off your bucket list because you've got to hear from him now. So, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Michael Buxton, who will put an overview of what we're up
to. Thank you, Rod. Rod's always a hard act to follow. I used to go to the grand final breakfast for the old Hailebarians. I wasn't an old Hailebarian, but anyway, I used to great crash every year, and Rod was the brilliant compere. And I'm not going to tell you any of the jokes he told. So thank you very much, Rod. I'm only speaking very strictly here for a short period of time, just basically to welcome you all. Thank you for coming on a very pleasant Sunday afternoon, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of the issues facing Melbourne before we hand over to our speakers and then your questions. So it's really between yourselves and the speakers and everybody else who will be watching this. So I just want to very quickly run through some of the issues that are really facing us. And I think the critical thing to me is that Melbourne at the moment is one of those cities that is facing a critical time in its history. This happens to cities occasionally. They don't just roll along. They do come up against very important issues that if not resolved at the time when they appear, then the city can roll on into dysfunction, or it can proceed into a vibrant and flourishing city. And I think Melbourne is facing one of those periods. Melbourne changed fundamentally from about 2003, 2005. And really, as Ivan Illich, the American planner philosopher, once said, the unthinkable can become obvious overnight. It's amazing how the issues of so many people coming into Melbourne and the lack of infrastructure investment were just on the agenda for people pushing like yourselves for so long. And and very few people were listening. And all of a sudden, I think in the last 6 months or so, there's been a fundamental shift in public opinion and political opinion, where there is now a recognition that when Melbourne is increasing in population by 800,000 every 7 years or so, about 1 million in 8 years, every 8 years, this has placed fundamental strains on our infrastructure and on the way of life and the potential for the city to survive. About $2 billion a year was spent on major infrastructure, such as transport infrastructure, to cater with this population in the 10 years to 2016, $2 billion a year. Since then it's rocketed up, the graph goes almost vertical. So there has been a fundamental change in that spending, which is a really welcome thing. Now very quickly, some issues. About the same number of people, when we look at that population, about the same number of people are coming to live in the inner part of Melbourne, the CBD and surrounding brownfield areas and some of the very close in inner suburbs, as in the middle ring suburbs, as in the new outer growth areas. Around about 8, over the last 8 years or so, it's varied a bit, but about 18,000 a year are coming to live in each, if we break the city up into each of those areas, inner, middle or established suburbs and the new outer growth corridors, about 18,000 a year, which is very interesting because a myth has developed in Melbourne about the missing middle. There are conferences about this, there's not enough development occurring in the established suburbs. It's about the same as the high-rise, and it's about the same as the outer urban low-rise sprawl. The missing middle is a myth. And it's extraordinary just how quickly this has changed. 2005, there were about 2,000 high-rise apartments being built in Melbourne a year. It was the beginning of it. And these are not commercial high-rise, office high-rise, which was traditionally the CBD. A new phenomenon occurred around about 2003 of residential high-rise. It was virtually unseen before then, and by about 2005-06, 2,000 were being built. A year ago, it went to 20,000. Right? 20,000 from 2000 and 2005. It's dropped down to about 18 now, and we're getting that same massive growth in apartment, but medium-rise. Low to medium-rise apartments and townhouses in the established suburbs. This population distribution has led to as you know, a tremendous concentration of population in Victoria, in Melbourne. The 5 capital cities of Australian states, the biggest 5 capitals, house 2/3 of the Australian population, and that trend is increasing. About 82% of all the people who come into Victoria come to live in Melbourne. And this poses particular problems for governments in planning. How do you, both parties, we'll talk about this today, both parties are now looking at regional growth, which is a really great thing, spending money on transport connections into regions, and the Liberal Party has put forward a very ambitious plan for that infrastructure. The question is, how do you shift that massive concentration in Melbourne into regions while bringing jobs and so on, enjoying that way of life? But when we look at the growth corridors, those outer urban areas, we're really setting up, there's so much work being done on this at the moment, but about 53% in the last 10 years of all the growth in Melbourne have gone to those outer urban growth corridors, over half, right? And they're the worst serviced areas in Melbourne, as we know. 1.5 million people have no real ready access to any public transport at all. and the service levels are the worst in Melbourne, as are the job provisions. So there's real issues for the future from the distribution of population and the type of development that is occurring. In a similar way, we're building all these high-rise in the city centre and surrounding areas. So inner suburban areas are now being taken over by high-rise. And this is a form of building which I think is going to fail as well. A lot of it's very low quality. I think a lot of it will be probably pulled down or dysfunctional within a generation, particularly with climate change, placing tremendous problems of heat and growth in temperature. So if we move from infrastructure, the myth of the missing middle, the myth of the missing middle, population distribution, to very quickly the planning system itself. And this is what I know you're interested in. We have a weak strategy in Victoria, but a very important planning system which basically empowers the development industry by being a relatively deregulated system. So if you have, and many of you have gone through the process of appeals and putting in objections, it's a layered, complex system which is discretionary. Very few mandatory principles, virtually none. So it really is very uncertain without that mandatory set of rules, and it means it's open for interpretation. It's a discretionary system, and so you go to VCAT, you get knocked off at VCAT because you have one interpretation, the VCAT member has another, and you wear yourself out. So we've all spoken about this very often, and the principle, I think, has to be the move towards more mandatory rules in the planning system. And very importantly, I think the Liberal Party did move towards this with its residential zones in the last government, and it particularly brought in controls on the neighbourhood residential zone to prohibit medium density and apartment construction in the neighbourhood residential zone, and that was applied fairly widely throughout heritage areas, and also height controls. And that was removed, the limitation on medium density development in the neighbourhood residential zone was removed by the Labor government, and the height controls were increased. So that has put tremendous pressure back on heritage areas and important areas of the residential system. And one other quick thing on the planning system is the commercial one and the mixed use zones. Many of you are from the inner suburbs and the middle ring suburbs, and we love our strip centres with our Victorian streetscapes with those shops, and they're totally unprotected. They have no mandatory height controls. International developers and money and local developers have moved in with hundreds of millions of dollars of buying this up and land banking, and they're all under threat unless somehow we can get height controls to stop facade development and the progressive pulling down of those beautiful strip centres, because those commercial zones simply have no rules attached to them which are mandatory or certain. So that's almost enough for me. I just want to mention 6 quick issues, and then we'll hand it over to the politicians that have come today. I think some of the issues that you've come up with and your questions will tease these out and develop them further. The future of strip shopping centres and their heritage, the lack of effective planning for built heritage, this crucial role of amenity. Heritage is not only a critical part of our city's identity and our personal well-being, but it's a very important economic driver. If we pull that down, we lose one of our greatest economic strengths. And the heritage protections are unquestionably one of the weakest lot in the Western world. New threats to the green belt and the peri-urban and rural areas, and the inadequacy of the current planning controls. There are same kind of constant disputes out there. Adaptation to climate change, how well prepared is our city for these major environmental issues? The big issue of affordable housing, where American states and many American cities have mandated affordable housing targets of 20 to 25% and building heights of 6 stories, and it works. Why can't we get mandated affordable housing in our development? Environmental issues. I know a lot of you are concerned about parkland, greater intensification, great pressure on environmental factors and tree cover, the future of regional development, which will be an issue today, and finally the cross-sectoral connections between land use, environmental, social and economic issues. It's terribly important to have governance that understands the way all those areas interact. So in conclusion, I think this is a fundamentally critical time for Melbourne. I think it's wonderful that you've all come here today, including our politicians who've given up their time, and lots more people will see this on the videos as it goes around the group. So thank you very much for coming, and back to Rod.
Thank you very much, Michael. And so I'll begin by introducing our first speaker, the Honourable David Davis, MLC, represents the Southern Metropolitan Electorate in the Legislative Council. Mr Davis is the Shadow Minister for each of the following portfolios: planning, public transport and equality. And he'll speak today on planning and public transport. So thank you. Where did you get a park?
I was lucky in the end, but you know what? My colleague came by train and I think it was a lot smarter.
Yes, I think make him Transport Minister.
Can I begin by just acknowledging my colleagues here today, and particularly the groups that have come together with an agenda for Melbourne's future. We are, I think, at a point of really very significant flexion, very significant decision making. We've got a huge population growth. It's historically huge, and Michael has given some layout of the spread of that growth and how it's impacting. But that growth, 143,000 last year, 147,000 the year before, that's the statewide population growth. Big chunk of overseas migration, significant natural births, 16,500 last year net movements from other states and territories. So that's a significant component in itself. But 90% of that population growth going into Melbourne. And you can feel it. You sometimes can't even get a park. But, you know, you can actually feel it as you try to move around. We know our public transport's crowded. We know the roads are congested. We know that there's difficulties with services, and we know that whether it's schools or health services or other government services, that there is real pressure on those. And we firmly are the view that the current government has lost control of that process. We actually need to get control of that process back. And there's a number of policies that we've outlined to deal with that. Part of this is about the future and what sort of city we want to live in. You know, the livability of Melbourne has been a huge advantage, something that we've treasured. We've had a city where heritage has been to the fore, our streetscapes, our vegetation. All of that has been a huge part of what has made Melbourne the great city that it was and still indeed is. But the pressure is there, and there's no question that it's getting more, and there's no question that, you know, however you want to point at it, as Michael's pointed out, well over a decade, over 15, 20 years, there's been a lack of new infrastructure to manage that, and a lack of thoughtful planning as to how we deal with that challenge. Now, we've made a number of recent announcements, including one today that I'll outline. The first of those is that we recognise that there are protections needed in this city. And that has meant, as Michael's alluded to, we will reintroduce the neighbourhood residential zones with their proper protections. We will reintroduce the protections to the general residential zones. It's only one component. The 8 metre height limit as opposed to 9 metres, the 2 dwelling cap in the NRZs will be restored, and we make no apologies for that, because it is actually about recognising that there are areas of the city that actually need protection and can't be there for open slather development. Equally, in the general residential zones, the 9-metre height limit was increased by that terrible planning amendment VC 110 in May 2017 to 11 metres, with an as-of-right 3 stories. Now that has sent some parts of our city off their tree because they actually can see a threat, a clear threat to what is going to, in what is going to happen to their suburbs. Whether in David's area on the Morington Peninsula has gone nuts on that. I think the petition has 10,000 signatures on that petition against that 11-metre height limit and 3 stories as of right, much of this in small seaside towns. So I think the government has misunderstood what's important to people. People actually want to protect our livability. They want to protect the quality of life. So we will restore those protections, and we are prepared to look at other areas too where they are needed. In terms of the focus on decentralisation, Matthew Guy singled out this area of population growth in 2015 and 2016 after we lost government and said this is an area that we have to systematically think about, systematically address. Had a task force, and some of the responses to that are now being released steadily. We have said there has to be a focus on using our regional cities and our country areas to support some of that growth. It can't continue at 90% of 140 or 150,000 year on year on year and successfully maintain the quality of life here. We can't cope with that kind of growth, but we can move some of it to our regional cities. We can do the work to actually bring forward the opportunity for our regional cities to play a greater role. And by and large, they're actually prepared to do so. Now, they will need support to do so, and I'll say some more about that in a minute. But we can do the planning work inside those regional cities to make sure that they can support more population growth. And we can provide the incentives, and today Matthew Guy's announced a cut to payroll tax in many of our regional areas. In country Victoria, down from 2.45, I think is the current level statewide, to 1% in regional cities, which we think will help underpin some of the economic growth that is an important part of actually providing the employment that underpins any decentralisation policy. So we're unashamedly saying we will have a Minister for Decentralisation, and that Minister will have responsibility with the Minister for Planning for actually working through many of these issues. And we've also said that we will put in place, and this is my portfolio, a fast European-style rail connection to our country centres. This is, I think, a game-changing policy. And we know how to do it. We've done the work. We understand what we need to do. We've committed between 15 and 19 billion to deliver that over a 10-year period, with some of it starting Geelong and Ballarat, but upgrades across a number of lines early on so that we get significant improvements early, but very substantial improvements over that period. In the case of Geelong, our aim is in 4 years to get to that 32-minute target to get to Geelong from Spencer Street, and 45 minutes to Ballarat, 70 minutes to Bendigo, 62 minutes to Traralgon, and similar increases to all of the other regional cities in terms of lifting the speed and the reliability and the quality of service on all of those regional lines. And we think this will make a massive difference to the opportunities that people have to work, to live, to commute. It makes a difference for tourism too in the other direction. And we think it will underpin a lot of the economic growth in these regional cities. So that is where our mind is at. That is what we think has got to occur. We've also said there'll be a population commission, a body centrally located, and its job will be to make sure that services follow the growth in population. Too often on the edge of the city, as Michael has pointed out, services have lagged massively. But that is true sometimes in country Victoria, and it's even true in the city, where we've got significant increases in density in many areas, significant increases in population, but there's no commensurate increase in school capacity. There's no equal increase in the health services. So we actually need, and some of these are not council problems, you know, the development community often points at councils and sometimes they're at fault. But actually often it's state government agencies that are slow to respond. State government agencies that have actually not delivered the parallel services that are needed where there's a population increase. So we will work to achieve these things. We will work to deal with the population growth in a systematic way. We will put in place the protections, and I'll make two quick comments, which I'm not sure are in the public domain other than in the material I put to the National Trust. And I'm not sure if they're published yet, but we will begin a heritage review on coming to government. I agree with Michael that our heritage protections need a systematic look at, and that is a commitment that we make. Equally, we need a systematic approach to open space. One thing that is very clear to me, as population increases, heritage becomes more important, placemaking becomes more important, and open space becomes more important. Where you've got more people, you actually need more open space, not less open space. You need places for recreation, you need places to improve and protect the quality of life, and we are very committed to those objectives. Thank you.
Well done. Thank you very much, David. I'd now like to introduce Mr. John... you okay? Oh, that's all right. Mr. John Pesutto, MP, elected in 2014 as the member for Hawthorn and has been Shadow Attorney General ever since. Thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure, Rod. Thank you to you and to all of the groups that have come together today. To those who have organised today, thank you so much. To all of my colleagues on the panel, Michael Buxton, that includes you too. It's a real pleasure to be here today because we are talking about issues of the greatest moment. And my colleague David outlined for you the context for that. And so as somebody who is standing before you, not just as somebody seeking re-election as the member for Hawthorn, but somebody who wants to be the next Attorney General in our state, how does that system of dispute resolution in VCAT and also the courts feed into that? And David was right. You have to set the context for all of this because how we deal with disputes in VCAT must sit in the broader context. And when we entered that period of opposition back in late 2014, no one was talking about population. No one was talking as we were about density and how we manage that. And through the establishment of the Population Task Force that Matthew effected, and all of the work it did across Melbourne, across all of the regions of our state, there has been 4 years of work put into this. And there are layers of the outcomes that have come out of that process. And some of you I know have been a part of that process, and I thank you for doing that. How we deal with population and decentralisation. You've seen the public transport commitments that David has already mentioned. European-style regional fast rail, upgrades to the Cranbourne line, the Baxter line, duplication out to Eltham, just some. Well over $20 billion of commitments already to public transport, and they're just some of the commitments. In terms of how we deal with migration growth, you saw perhaps during the week that Matthew and Margaret Fitzherbert, one of David's colleagues in the upper house, made an announcement about how we can work as a state along with the other states to try and ensure we're placing people, as far as incentives will allow under the point system, right across our state to take that pressure off Melbourne. Because if we don't do all of these things right across the policy space, the pressure on VCAT will almost be irredeemable. So we are committed to looking at how these processes in VCAT have served you, and I know it hasn't served you well. I've spoken to many of you, including many others, over the last 4 years about your legitimate frustrations with the process. First of all, access. With increases in fees, it's been hard for some of you to even launch appeals against permit approvals. I think that is something that we should look at to see what scope there is to improve access to dispute resolution in VCAT. The cost of lawyers. Now, guilty, I am a lawyer. But I also know how expensive it becomes. And when I consider all of the groups I've met with and dealing with their anguish over the process, the most common one, which I know many of you have experienced, is that it is just far too expensive. If not just to launch an appeal against a decision, to defend it if you are successful. I had a group that I was working with who was successful at first instance in VCAT. It was appealed. So you had a decision made in your favour as residents, but they couldn't defend it because they were worried about an adverse costs order. Now you might ask yourself, is it the residents' fault if they are contesting an appeal which they won at first instance? And I've said to them that is something we should look at to ensure that if you get that decision in your favour at the first instance, you could look at whether that operates as an unfair disadvantage on you and a deterrent to pursue a decision that you won at first instance. And appeals against VCAT decisions. It's very hard, in the general sense of appeals, for residents to maintain their position and go forward, even when councils balk at the opportunity to defend a decision that they might have made. As David said, not all councils get it right. But the approach I want to take to VCAT, and I must be candid with you, we are working on announcing something in the next few weeks. That occasion is not today. But we will have more to say on this in the coming weeks. But the general conceptual approach should be that as long as a council is following local planning policy, it should be much harder for that to be overturned on appeal in VCAT or anywhere else. And at the heart of that lies the question of local democracy. And if it means anything, your local representatives in formulating the policies on your behalf should be given more force when contested in VCAT or beyond in the appeal stage. That's what local democracy means. So we are on the same page with many of the grievances you have expressed, and we'll have more to say in the coming weeks. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you very much, John. And now I'd like to introduce Mr. David Morris. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly in November 2006 as the member for Morington, and he's the Shadow Minister for Local Government. That must be a hell of a job. And Shadow Minister for Finance. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you, Rod. And good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Can I acknowledge my colleagues on the panel up the front here, but particularly can I acknowledge all of you who are sitting in the room, because we know it's been filmed, but the critical element of the sorts of areas that we're discussing this afternoon is always input, as John was saying. It's about local democracy, and all of the issues we're talking about this afternoon are things that affect people's lives directly, and you can't make that sort of policy in a vacuum, and you need to have those debates to get the balance right. So I do appreciate the fact that you've turned out on what has turned out to be a very lovely Sunday afternoon, and have come inside to come and engage in this sort of debate. I'm just been asked to talk about local government policy, some of which we've announced, some of which I will try and give you an indication of where we might be going in the next couple of weeks. In terms of the two policies we've announced, they are both specific to particular councils. The first relates to the Sunbury area of the Hume Council, and some of you may be aware that in the last probably 4 months of the Napthine government, a process that had been running for some time was finalised. A new Sunbury City Council was gazetted with the intention of having it up and running by the end of June 2019. When the Andrews government came in, one of the first things they did was say, all right, we don't want to proceed with this. We're going to send a couple of auditors in because we don't think it stacks up. It did. But they went and handpicked a couple of auditors who, of course, came back with the usual response you get when you handpick an auditor. They said, no, it doesn't stack up. So it was abandoned. But we announced a couple of weeks ago now that we have made a commitment to proceed with that, and we will be proceeding with that as quickly as is humanly possible, and certainly council elections will proceed with the normal 2020 council election period. The second area I had the pleasure of announcing on Friday, and that is the Phillip Island area of the Bass Coast Council. A very different area to the balance of Bass Coast. And what we've announced there is different. With Sunbury out of Hume, we'd had an inquiry, we'd had a referendum. The view of the community was they wanted it to proceed. With Phillip Island, we know that there is an immense groundswell on the island, that they feel that they should not be part of the Bass Coast Council for a range of issues, which I don't need to go into this afternoon. But that hasn't been tested. The financial viability hasn't been tested, and the concept and the view of the local community has not been tested. So what we've undertaken in the case of the Phillip Island area of Bass Coast is to get that work done. We're funding that work. It'll start in February next year, should we be successful, with a view to having a referendum completed before Christmas next year, and then a new council established in February, March 2020. So probably 3 or 4 months of administrators just to get things set up and running smoothly, with councillors elected at the general election in 2020. So in both cases, and I want to make this point very strongly, in both cases, those policies have been driven by the local community. If I become local government minister, I won't be proceeding with things that do not stack up financially, but if the community has a particular view and it can be made to stack up financially, then I think the shape of local government should and is absolutely in the hands of the community. Now, in the 20 seconds or so I've got left, I just want to flag another issue which I know is affecting some people, but it is bit particularly hard in rural areas, and that is the way the current rating system is impacting on individuals. It's hit, as I say, particularly farmers, but I know in metropolitan Melbourne I've had other examples where the rating system is just not working. I'm not about to make a particular announcement this afternoon, but stay tuned, because in the next few days, certainly by the middle of the week, we will be having something more to say in that space. Again, thank you for coming out. I do congratulate you for being interested in the engagement. Thanks very much.
Thank you, David. Now I'd like to introduce Ms Ellen Sandell, who is represents the electorate of Melbourne. She's done that since 2014. She's a Victorian Green spokesperson for Treasury and Finance and Climate Change and Environment and National Parks and Resources and Science and Innovation and Major Events in brackets cultural. That must be a fantastic
Thanks,
card
Rod.
you hand out, is it?
We need some more greens so that I've got less work to do. So someone's going to help elect some more greens so I don't have so many portfolios. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm Ellen Sandell. I'm the state member for Melbourne, which of course includes the CBD, so welcome to my hood. And it's nice to see some of my local representatives from residents groups in the audience as well. I never grew up wanting to be a politician. I think that if you do, perhaps you're a little bit odd. I always grew up wanting to be a scientist, and that's what I studied here at Melbourne University before I went on to start my career in science and then went on to run a national climate change organisation. And I spent a lot of my time campaigning to get politicians to make better decisions, to make decisions based on evidence and science, and to listen to the experts. And we all know how that's turning out. After a while of banging my head against a brick wall trying to do that, I realised if politicians aren't going to listen to the scientists and the experts and the evidence, maybe we just need to elect people who will. So I put my hand up to run. In 2014 for the seat of Melbourne. And as many of you would remember, many of you were involved, we were fighting the East-West toll road. And this is a wonderful example of what we can do when the two old parties are united in their desire to build a project that we know doesn't stack up, when the community campaigns with progressive other parties and community raises their voice and the campaign becomes so strong, we can overturn decisions where it seems like a fait accompli. That's what we did with the East-West Toll Road. We won that campaign together. But to be honest, now in 2018, going into another state election, it does feel a little bit like deja vu. We have the two major parties competing with their alternate toll road plans. The Liberals want to bring back the East-West Toll Road. Labor wants to build the Westgate Toll Road and the North East Link. Projects like the Westgate Toll Road, where government's own experts are telling them it will not work, it will not stack up. We have a Labor government that has extended coal licences in Victoria, a planning minister who's just fast-tracked approval of a new coal plant in Victoria and exempted himself from a whole bunch of planning provisions from doing so, and a Liberal government that wants to rip up our clean energy laws. And of course, we know we have a planning system that has spectacularly failed. And as Michael Buxton said, there are many people, including the Greens and the community, who have been saying for years that if you let developers and toll road companies and big corporates build whatever they want, wherever they want, if you sell off our public assets and public land to the highest bidder, if you encourage growth without any of the infrastructure to match, if you refuse to put in place strict laws to protect what we love about Melbourne, like our heritage and our parks, what do you get? You get increased congestion. You get a city that is becoming more and more unlivable. And what you also get is voter revolt. And that's what we're seeing now. We're seeing voters saying this system has absolutely failed, and they're turning to independents and Greens and alternate political systems to say enough is enough. We need a different way of doing things. And now the governments are starting to tune into that, and they're frantically playing catch up, trying to invest in infrastructure to catch up with the population growth that they should have seen coming. Now, the Greens have an alternate vision for our state. It's a vision where our state is actually powered by renewable energy, not coal. It's a vision for our state where the government actually builds public housing rather than selling off public housing land. It's a vision where governments do what they're supposed to do, which is provide services for the public, not beholden to big corporate interests. And we're seeing this Andrews government, something that I'm very upset about, has the strongest privatisation agenda since Kennett. Sold off our port, selling off our public housing land, sold off our land titles office, but trying to spin themselves as progressive. Now, that's a snapshot of some of the issues I think we're facing this election. I'm going to leave most of the specific planning policy to my colleague Kathleen Maltzahn, who's running in Richmond. But know that just like we defeated the East-West Toll Road, we can have an incredible influence at this election. The government only holds power by one seat in Victoria's Legislative Assembly. The Greens could pick up 2 more this election, hold the 3 we've got and win balance of power. These are the alternatives that people are looking for to get the change that we're looking for. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. And now I'd like to introduce Ms Kathleen Maltzahn. She's the Greens candidate for the seat of Richmond, having previously contested this seat in 2014. Welcome, Kathleen.
Thanks, Rod. Can I start by acknowledging that we meet on Wurundjeri ground, beautiful country, sovereign country, land never ceded. And like the other speakers, I want to pay tribute for you being here today. You are Melbourne's guardians. Guardians, I think, of the livability of this city, guardians of the heritage, the Victorian heritage, the between the wars heritage, the living heritage. Melbourne's heritage as a fair city where we welcome people here and never scapegoat them. Heritage of a city that we love living in. Guardians of a city that we love living in, but many of us feel is at risk. So thank you for being here today. And it's a little bit odd because I want to acknowledge the Liberals in the room, my old friend Steve, my colleague Ellen, and say, where is the Labor Party? Why won't they front up here today? For those of you, and it's nice to see some people from Richmond, the Planning Minister is our local member. Why won't he come and talk to people here? And part of the answer, I think, is because they don't have the answers that we need. So Ellen and others have very eloquently laid out the problem we have. If you read The Age this morning, you'll have seen the stories about Casey, where there's pretty explicit references to at least almost corruption because of the way the planning scheme's working. And if you're from the north, you will have seen a report that apparently, you wouldn't have noticed if you live in the area, the northern suburbs is absolutely ill-equipped to deal with the growing population. Now, I don't know if you noticed the author of that report saying it's really terrible, neglected area, Justin Madden, former planning minister, and this is the pattern we have. People in government do nothing, get a good job as a consultant and come back and tell us how to fix things. I want to say we can fix them now. And an AI. So Ellen's talked about the broad problem. I want to talk about some specific things the Greens are committing to do, not something we're going to put in a report when we're a consultant once we're out of Parliament. The first thing that we want to see is affordable housing mandated. So our policy is to have 30% affordable housing in every development with 100 apartments or more and tapering down over that. Young people are being squeezed out of this city. We have to change that. We want to see maximum heights and minimum apartment sizes. Michael's spoken very eloquently about why that's necessary. It's partly heritage protection, but it's partly fairness. Because while big developers can spend millions and millions buying sites to go sky high, good developers who want to do beautiful homes can't compete. Minimum apartment sizes too mean that people who are living in apartments can have a good life there and not live without air and light. We want to see decent sustainability levels. So in our policy, we would have 8-star as a minimum. We would have 50% of rooftops devoted to either green roofs or solar to help us cut carbon emissions, but also to do something about the heat that is killing people already in this city and will kill more people as climate change exacerbates. We want to connect how we build our homes with how we get around. You know, we have an act that says that transport should be integrated with built form planning, but it doesn't happen. So we want, Jackie Fristacchi and I should have acknowledged earlier the councillors in the room, Councillor Fristacchi from Yarra and I were this morning at a pretend launch of a new Fitzroy railway station, extending Melbourne Metro and making it into Melbourne, adding to Melbourne Metro too. So we need decent public transport. And we need to reform VCAT so that it is no longer undoing the work of council. It should only be there to fix where there are mistakes by council, and we need controls on ministerial decisions so that they can't just wave through coal projects, Apple in Fed Square, and any other host of things without checks. Now, many of you will have spent time at council trying to argue for those sorts of things, or at VCAT. And many of you will have spent many hours of your life and many dollars from your community trying to get better results. But the system doesn't allow us to prevail. And I want to say to you, if you think about how to spend your time and money to make a difference, now's the time. This election is where we will set the direction for Melbourne. With respect, the Liberal Party hasn't done much better than Labor. But the Greens in balance of power can put in those policies, force whoever is government to deliver for Melbourne and secure what we love and prepare us for the future.
Welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Rod. And like Kathleen, I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri as traditional owners of this land. I know many of you in the room over the last 14 years as a socialist councillor in the city of Yarra, in the front line with you against this one-sided development that dominates this city and this country at the present moment in time. The context for this debate, this discussion we're having today, is the South Sea bubble of the property speculation because of the irresponsibility of the banks, the irresponsibility of the tax breaks, that is seeing the most one-sided development that we've ever seen. I work in the construction industry. You look out the window here today, there's 7 cranes in Collingwood. There's 250 cranes in Melbourne. We've never had more development in this city, and yet we've never had more people living on the streets. We've got our kids suffering rental stress. We've our kids couch surfing. It's never been more expensive for a young person to buy a house. It's never been harder for young people and for working class people to live in the inner city as what it is now. Because the units that we're building are tiny micro apartments that are not built for the likes of families and working class people and young people. They're built for developers and they're built for investors. I've moved in recently to a new private block of units in Wellington Street, Collingwood, and it's like living in a morgue. Most of the units are empty. They've all been sold, they're all owned, but they're not being lived in. So therefore, what we need is a plan. Whatever you might think of those gangsters who came here in 1835 and stole the land off the Indigenous people and created Melbourne, one thing they did have was a plan. They said that for X number of people that move into this area, we're going to increase the number of churches, we're going to increase the number of schools, we're going to increase the number of whatever it might be. That's not happening here. The councils are approving almost anything, if left, unchecked, anything that comes their way, because they need the rate money. The state government are not, there's no matrix for the increase in population to have an increase in public transport, increase in education facilities, increase in social infrastructure. In my area, even the sports clubs have had to start capping the number of kids who can join the sports clubs. So the first thing that we need is a plan. Planning is a misnomer. There is no plan in Melbourne. It's a frenzy for developers and we're being left out. So what do we want to do about it? Well, the first thing that I've been fighting for in the city of Yarra, but also, of course, as a leader of the Victorian Socialists, which are going for the upper house seat in Northern Metro, is that we need to get rid of preferred and replace it with mandatory. We don't have preferred parking fines, but we have preferred almost everything when it comes to the local and state planning scheme. That has got to end. We've got to have some certainty. It's actually good for investors and developers, actually, but it's got to be good for residents. That's the state and local planning schemes at the moment, you can drive a truck through it. And that's what the developers are doing at the present moment in time. The second thing we need to do, as Professor Buxton referred to, is the geese that laid the golden egg have got to be protected. We've got to protect our shopping strips. We think there should be no development allowed on shopping strips within 10 metres of the frontage. That is what's attracting people to the likes of Fitzroy, Collingwood and other parts of Melbourne. We can't destroy that. Other cities don't do that, but we're in the process of doing that. If you walk down Bridge Road in Richmond, you'll know what I'm talking about. The other thing, as Kathleen correctly said, is we'll have to have inclusionary zoning. Without lifting one little finger, we could have thousands of homes available for our kids and for people who can't afford to live in the inner city if we had 20% low-cost housing. Now, we know the Labor Party agrees with this because they've just put it in, the gas and fuel site, because they're about to, maybe lose their seat to Kathleen on the 24th of November. So they're all panicking and they've put in 20% low-cost housing on the gas and fuel side, a major development. Why don't they do that on all the large developments in Melbourne? That would have created in the last 2 years 10,500 low-cost units for people who currently couldn't afford to live in the inner city. The other point that we need to do is we need to put in VCAT. We're all fed up of this merry-go-round where you go, even if you've got a strong resident group, you go to you go to the council, you get the council on side, you block a development, they just run off to VCAT, and a non-elected tribunal overturns an elected decision of elected members. That's got to stop. But the final point I want to make is there has to be strong resident groups. The thing that I've learned in the last 14 years, every single win we've had is when the councillors and the local member have been bred down their neck by strong residents groups. We have the North Fitzroy win over Gurner, which spilled over into the gas and fuel win. Why? Because you couldn't get into a meeting of the North Fitzroy residents group. If there was less than 400 people, I'd be shot dead tomorrow. It was absolutely jam-packed. And the people who run this state, the people who run that area looked at that and they made a clinical decision that to try and stop the Greens in North Fitzroy, they would do the right thing by the residents. So strong residents associations are vital no matter who wins on November 24th. You've got to keep your powder dry. You cannot trust any politicians. The major parties are in the pocket, literally, of the developers. Only have to look at the AEC website, who funds the major parties. And that's why, yes, we have to change planning laws and we have to vote for people who do that, but we also have to have strong residents' associations. Thank you.
Thanks, Steve. I have a letter from Richard Wynne to the State Election Forum. Thank you for your invitation to speak at this forum. Unfortunately, it clashes with my commitment to attend Sunday's ALP campaign launch at Monash University. Had I been able to come, I would have made the following points. As Planning Minister over the last 4 years, I have sought to restore integrity to the planning system and to make decisions based on merit, providing a consistent and predictable framework for development to occur. I'm only reading it, okay? The mistakes of my predecessor are being rectified and viable long-term plans put in place. Victoria's heritage is now better protected, open space is being expanded and building regulations better enforced. Victoria now has clear long-term plans to grow sustainably whilst retaining character and livability. Public transport, schools and community facilities are no longer being planned as an afterthought. Strategic areas in established Melbourne are now being properly planned for development, and new rules require quality in building and delivery of affordable housing. However, we won't stop there. This week we also announced that a re-elected Andrews Labor government will introduce tough new design standards for all apartment buildings and new measures to give buyers confidence that they will get what they paid for when buying off the plan. But there is a lot more to be done, and if the Labor government has the honour of being re-elected in November, there is a big agenda to work for ahead of us. 1, implementing the 2017 version of Plan Melbourne. 2, rebalancing the way Melbourne is growing. 3, protecting existing neighbourhoods and introducing minimum garden requirements. 4, planning for the whole state by using Labor's new legislation, distinctive areas such as the Macedon Ranges, Surf Coast and the Bellarine Peninsula.
Morington.
Well, I can't answer that. I'm not the minister. Ensuring developers make for growth areas infrastructure contributions towards the timely delivery of public transport, schools and community facilities. Making significant investments in public transport, including the Metro Tunnel, level crossing removals, the suburban rail loop and new generation trams and trains to carry more passengers with more frequent and reliable services. Building the North East Link to respond to the traffic demands and to keep traffic and big trucks out of the inner city. Protecting Melbourne's heritage and open space and investing in new parks to maintain Melbourne's global reputation. The consequences of a coalition government would be dramatic and adverse to the priorities of community groups. Matthew Guy has committed to resuscitate the East-West Link, approve 290,000 additional lots on the urban fringe, remove controls over building heights in central Melbourne and abolish controls in the C270, protect setbacks and overshadowing. Return to the flawed residential zones that he first introduced, which would change mandatory height limits. The Coalition has a terrible record in... Sorry, I'm only reading it, okay? The Coalition has a terrible record in government for riding roughshod over communities, destroying open space, rezoning Green Regis land and doing deals with developers. I thank you for this opportunity to outline what a re-elected Andrews government would do to ensure Victoria remains a leader in planning for the future. I also thank you for the time and effort you've put into arranging planning issues and engaging with the local communities. We may not always agree on priorities or what is achievable, but we all wish to make our state a better and more sustainable place to live. Yours sincerely, Richard Wynne, Minister for Planning. So now we've heard from our 5 live panellists and our 1 off-site panellist. Unfortunately, as pointed out earlier, there is no, sorry, I've hit a button. There is no representative of the Labor Party to discuss these issues. Sorry? Where? Where?
We have Jennifer Cannis, ALP candidate for Melbourne, in the room. She's arrived late.
Oh, I'm sorry, I had no...
Please, she's here.
Would you...
Jennifer.
Oh, please, if you're happy to come and join the panel? If you...
I wasn't invited, but I thought I would come along anyway.
Well, if you feel... no, well, look, I think it's... we would all think it a very significant contribution, but if you feel you're not, in a position to deal with the issues that we're talking about today, we'd understand. But you're very welcome to join us.
I'm ready to come down and join you.
All right, thank you very much. Phew! I'm so pleased you came. Did you come on public transport?
I usually do, but I've been out at Monash. So
Oh, okay. Oh, of course you have, yes. Okay.
not at Monash, that was out.
All right, well, look, as I mentioned at the very beginning, what we have done is to pre-order questions from you. Many of the people who asked or have sent the questions in are with us today, many are not. You also had an opportunity to write down a question at the door when you entered, and those will be included in this list. We won't get through them all, and many of them overlapped and clearly covered the same sorts of topics, so the organisers have done their best to represent everybody's concerns and select those questions which seem most appropriate to getting an answer to those concerns. Now, it's very difficult. There's quite a lot of them, and so look, I'll just begin, and this is really one for the panel, and it comes from Rosemary West of the Green Wedges Coalition. Will your party commit to a permanent urban growth boundary with no more reviews and no further expansion of the urban growth boundaries for urban sprawl?
Yes.
Oh, I like this question and answer. This is good. Thank you.
Yes, we support maintaining the green wedges and urban growth boundaries.
Yes.
Yep.
When I was in Parliament in 2012 to 14, we actually made sure that we did protect the urban growth boundaries.
Will that continue?
Yes.
Good, okay, thank you. I love ones with just yes. All right, now this is from, oh no, I won't, because that's Rosemary again. She writes a lot of questions. I'll ask one from Mary Drost, who's one of the organisers, just to make that clear. And this is to David Davis. If you become Planning Minister, will you allow councils to have height allowed in shopping strips and commercial corridors to be mandatory and not just preferred, as the present Planning Minister did so to so many areas to allow unlimited development?
So, Mary, I think this is a very fair point, and it relates to some points that Michael made about our shopping strips, which I think are under real pressure. We've obviously got to look at these individually, one by one, and one of the things a heritage review can do is to actually look closely at our shopping strips. In government, areas like Mentone had a 4-storey height limit put on them by Matthew Guy, as did areas in Boroondara and Knox, and I could go on. They have been stripped out by the current government, so there is now no mandatory height limit in a place like Mentone. There is no mandatory height limit in many of the main roads in Boroondara now, and I could go on. We think there is a sensible position for clear mandatory limits, not absolutely everywhere, but in key locations, which provide certainty and predictability, and pointing to some of the legal points that John made before, where there is a mandatory height limit, it is mandatory and hence not amenable to legal challenge.
Just on that, mandatory height limits should be available everywhere, and the Greens policy is where a council sets a mandatory height limit, it should be just that, mandatory, not just in the leafy eastern suburbs.
Steve?
Can I just add, Rod, that one of the problems is that council spend so much time doing the strategic work to get these, their positions in place, and so our policy is that where the strategic work has been done in the last 2 years, the government should and the Greens would adopt those limits, so councils don't have to start on November 25 doing the work all over again.
It's a bit surreal to listen to the major parties talking about protecting shopping strips, because they're actually being destroyed as we speak. Just walk down Bridge Road. 2 months ago, we had the beautiful nursery in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy. Somebody's come along with a block 5-storey development. It's honestly like the East German Communist Party headquarters. It's the ugliest building you've ever seen in your life. And we managed, because of the community opposition and the fact that Limo, the comedian, was one of the objectors, and that maybe freaked out some of the councillors a little bit. One story of it, but they've got 4 stories. This is happening right now. So, you know, I'm a little bit over, sorry, I'm a little bit...
The government should and the Greens would adopt those limits so councils don't have to start on November 25 doing the work all over again.
It's a bit surreal to listen to the major parties talking about protecting shopping strips, because they're actually being destroyed as we speak. Just walk down Bridge Road. 2 months ago, we had the beautiful nursery in Brunswick Street, Fitzroy. Somebody's come along with a block 5-storey development. It's honestly like the East German Communist Party headquarters. It's the ugliest building you've ever seen in your life. And we managed, because of the community opposition and the fact that Limo, the comedian, was one of the objectors, and that maybe freaked out some of the councillors a little bit, we managed to knock off 1 story of it, but they've got 4 stories. This is happening right now. So, you know, I'm a little bit over, sorry, I'm a little bit over just hearing all these promises. These guys have been running the state government since year dot, and this is happening right now. It's too late almost for some areas, especially for Bridge Road. It has to happen. What Professor Buxton said is protection of the shopping strips, like what happens in Dublin, like what happens in many countries of the world. I've just come back from Amsterdam. It's not really rocket science. It's not a radical socialist thing. It's what attracts people to that area. And it's going to be replaced by a South Bank style development if we don't step up now and do what needs to be done.
Would you? You don't have to. No,
Take the microphone.
Yeah, sorry.
I didn't take the microphone because I thought it was a question for the others, but and I'm much more focused on central Melbourne rather than shopping strips and areas outside of Melbourne, so I didn't want to speak outside my knowledge area.
All right, thank you. All right, well then we'll move to something equally outside your knowledge, residential planning.
Can I just make
Yes,
one
please
other
do.
point that
No.
John reminds me of? There's a number of these occasions in shopping centres, in key locations, where from opposition we have actually blocked that happening. So the most clearest example is Ormond, where the government put a 13-storey tower in, and we, through a revocation, through my motion, and had support from some other parties, but not the Labor Party, that was blocked. And what came back, arguably still too big, but lesser than it was.
Do you allow Whitehall's and Manningham to build though?
Okay. Now, I'll move on to the next planning question. We've got quite a lot of issues, so I'll be as quick as this long question can be. This is from Rosemary West. We appreciate the Liberal Party's pledge to restore the 9-metre height limit to the general residential zone and the 8-metre height limit and ban on more than 2 dwellings on a neighbourhood residential zone lot. But what will you do for councils like Kingston and Frankston, whose new residential zones submissions were unsuccessful in 2014 and who consequently have had to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars undertaking new neighbourhood character and residential strategies, and who still virtually have no neighbourhood residential zones?
There's a number of areas I am very sympathetic to seeing a sensible spread of neighbourhood residential zones declared, and we're prepared to engage strongly with councils and communities on that. These can't be imposed from above, as I would say very strongly. They actually have to be worked through with council and community, and we will do so.
Any other comment on that? No? Oh, Steve, yeah? Oh, and...
Sorry, it's the same thing happened in Melbourne. There are parts of Kensington and other suburbs that didn't get neighbourhood residential or the zones that they wanted, so I hope that will be part of it as well, and also parts of Brunswick, for example. We also have some very significant shopping strips in inner Melbourne, places like Errol Street, places like Macaulay Road, that are also quite deserving of protection, so it's not just something that's isolated to those outer suburbs.
Mm-hmm. Yep, Steve?
Oh, sorry. I think it's a little bit of a diversion. There's not that much between the major parties on residential zones, and we all know we might as well give up in commercial zones. The developers can do what they want. But what's in the middle with the mixed use is where all the investors and the developers are looking at the moment. That's where they're going crazy. And there's no debate around that at the moment. And if you live next to a mixed zone, which many, many people do in the inner city, you're absolutely stuffed. You don't have no rights, but you've got a lot fewer rights than if you're in a residential zone, purely in a residential zone and somebody builds next to you. The mixed use zone has to be a 13-metre limit. That's something that Professor Buxton has raised in the community. That's something that I agree, and that's where the real battle will lay. And it's actually been fought out by developers and council in the mixed-use zones at the present moment in time. And we're off in this tangent about residential zones, but it's the mixed-use zones that I think we need to focus a little bit more on, in my opinion.
Could I just add, Rod? I mean, one of the things at the moment I think we're all doing is trying to make a really broken planning system fit our areas, and it takes a lot of time and money, and usually the fit isn't good. So one of the commitments that the Greens is making is to have a parliamentary inquiry into the Planning and Environment Act, so we can see all the complex bits, how they work together and how to fix it, because the bits and pieces promises that we've seen in the last 10 years has delivered us a worse mess than we had. So we need to really look at the whole system.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please. Yep. Sorry.
I just wanted to add a comment in that you heard David and I talk about local democracy and the importance of it. I just want to give you a perspective, not in my capacity as Shadow Attorney General, but as member for Hawthorn. I was very concerned when I was running, and I believe it is still the position, that Ellen, with all due respect, the Greens do support urban densification, and the last time I looked at the published material by your party, it did advocate urban densification. Now, there's been...
That's how you do it.
Well, what I hear from, not yourself in fairness, Ellen, but I've heard from other members of the Green, I believe it was a former endorsed candidate, came and attacked my constituents in a sense, and I'll explain why I say that, because he made a comment around about the last election that said that people in leafy suburbs don't deserve protections. Now, my argument, which you heard me articulate in my opening remarks, is, does local democracy mean anything to you? And if your council areas want to develop local planning policy within a state framework that represents the democratically expressed view of that local community, and that should be respected. And I hear, even Ellen, you made the comment before, and I think it was probably, if I'm mistaken, I apologise, but you did use the term leafy suburbs. And I take that to mean areas like Burundara, areas like Stonington, where we do pay a heavy price because we invest in heritage, we invest in protecting the character and amenity. And, a lot of my constituents, Ellen, would not welcome that kind of reference that they're getting some special treatment. They just want a democratically elected local government making decisions within a state framework to protect the character and amenity. And not you, but one of your colleagues did make that a couple of years ago, and I think the continuing position in the published material by your party is that you support urban densification. That unsettles a lot of us, certainly in my area. You may want to comment.
Look, the reason that I said that is because a lot of the published material we see out of the Liberal Party is picking and choosing areas that they represent or marginal seats that they want to win to try and protect those areas and fair enough, but without regard to a lot of the other areas that other people represent where also people live that also deserve protection. So we're for protection across the board. That's our policy. You look at all our published material, we're for protection for mandatory heights across the board, rather than picking and choosing and saying, well, you're lucky you get protection, but over here you're allowed to have 30 stories, no problem.
Well, except that when it came to distinctive areas, and I went to move to entrench the distinctive areas in the Yarra Ranges, the Macedon Ranges, and the Bellarine and the Morington Peninsula, your party voted against it. And when I went to overturn the VC 110 application in those and to suppress it with respect to distinctive landscapes and areas, your party voted against it. So you actually had the opportunity and you voted against it.
Okay. There was a lot of political games in that. There's a lot of political games. There's a lot of history behind that they're not telling you.
No, there's not. Good. It's a debate. Oh.
Sorry, Matt. I hope that wasn't directed at me because I believe I was very respectful. Yeah. Look, I understand that, but we're just trying to respond to
Yes,
ideas and concepts.
No,
rather
look,
than-
I will sit with what we're doing. I'll come to what I think is really, well, this is my opinion, a very significant issue around all of this. Since, this is from Clifford Hayes of Sustainable Australia. Since Melbourne is facing such an acute planning problem and such overstretched infrastructure, do you not think it absolutely imperative to call for a pause or a lowering in migration numbers till the occurrence of the much promised dispersal of people out to regions where more population is wanted? Are you committed to Melbourne at 8 million? Oh my God. I used to be special, now I'm not.
So Clifford is an old friend of mine from a leafy suburb. Dear, shocking really, Clifford, that you should come from a leafy suburb, but it's a great suburb. My point in answering this question is to say the state government firstly doesn't control the population entry into Australia. The second, no, let me just say, I'm going to explain what we will do. Well, we've made...
There are far too many people here with black hair and funny names today, and they're all out in our streets.
Can I say that we have been quite clear that we will work with the federal government to actually ensure that there is a greater decentralisation of the group of people that are coming into the country, particularly the work visa group, where we think there are opportunities for that group to work, or for the state to actually initiate movement of some of those people into our regional centres where there are often labour shortages, and parallel with that there are opportunities for significant growth. We've also said that we don't agree with Melbourne growing endlessly in a way that is uncontrolled, completely out of control, and we actually need to get back in control of that, and that means the decentralisation agenda in part that we're talking about, and it means dealing with some of the other issues that I've outlined in terms of making sure that where there is growth, there's proper services with it.
So I'm going to surprise myself by starting with agreeing with David in the sense that this is not something that state government controls, but we see, I'm sorry, you just gave us an example of where this debate goes, and the Greens do not support a debate that is covering up the failure of state governments to provide infrastructure with a tax on people who may be newer to this country. In the last 15 years, Victoria has spent half the amount on infrastructure as New South Wales. So a whole lot of the strains we experience are not because of migration, which was predicted and predictable, but because of government's failure to invest. And I'm really, one of the things that grieves me in this state election is the way some political actors are choosing to put race in the equation when we have never done that in Victoria. Well, the question... Would you like me to finish? The question up the back, the place that was taken, absolutely referenced race. So what I would say is let's try and fix the infrastructure problem we have. Let's plan for who's here and what's here and who's coming. And you can take up federally however you want with population. But when we start talking population, it starts hurting a lot of people.
This growth, there's proper services with it.
So I'm going to surprise myself by starting with agreeing with David in the sense that this is not something that state government controls, but we see, I'm sorry, you just gave us an example of where this debate goes, and the Greens do not support a debate that is covering up the failure of state governments to provide infrastructure with a tax on people who may be newer to this country. In the last 15 years, Victoria has spent half the amount on infrastructure as New South Wales. So a whole lot of the strains we experience are not because of migration, which was predicted and predictable, but because of government's failure to invest. And I'm really, one of the things that grieves me in this state election is the way some political actors are choosing to put race in the equation when we have never done that in Victoria. Well, the question, would you like me to finish? The question up the back, the place that was taken, absolutely referenced race. So what I would say is let's try and fix the infrastructure problem we have. Let's plan for who's here and what's here and who's coming. And you can take up federally however you want with population. But when we start talking population, it starts hurting a lot of people in this community, and it's dangerous territory. So we can population, it starts hurting a lot of people in this community, and it's dangerous territory. So we can have a discussion. You know, if you want to talk about population, let me just go, you know, meta. Let's talk about climate change and stop the climate refugees who are going to be forced out.
Hang on,
Let's
sorry.
deal with war.
No, look, at the moment it's for the panel. If we get time at the end, we will allow you to ask questions. Yep.
You know, we have a choice about taking on the powerful or taking on the weak. And when you talk population, you take on the weak at the expense of the powerful. So right now in a state election, we can put pressure on the Liberals, we can put pressure on the Labor Party, you can have those of us who might be on the crossbench committing to you to fix the things in our control.
We're not attacking my group.
Okay. I think those of us here who think about these things understand exactly what you said. It is a federal issue. People in Victoria have had to, all over Australia, have had to bear the burden of those increases and have to adjust for them.
Rod, can I just have one quick go on
Yes,
that?
please.
Yeah, I mean, if you just compare South Bank to the impending development on the Amcor site, where 2,500 units are going to be developed. It's quite interesting in terms of whatever side of this debate you come on. Down in South Bank, and I've worked on South Bank and in Docklands, it was just unrestrained development. The only social service that was built there was like a 7-Eleven. Now they're slowly catching up with schools and so on. So whether you put 500 people there or 5,000 people there, they just joined the back of the queue of currently existing services, and it raised all issues like what people are raising in the terms of this question tonight. At the Amcor site in Alphington, thanks to a massive community mobilisation, they got a school put in, they got a childcare put in, they got 3 small parks and indoor sports centre. It's by no means perfect, but it's eased the pain. You'd normally put 2,500 people in a city, they would be joining the back of the queue. But because they increased social services on that site, as they're about to do in the gas and fuel, not out of the goodness of the Labor Party's heart, because they don't want to lose the election to Kathleen in that area, and in Northcote, that's in my cynical position. But nevertheless, because they've increased social services, it's much less of an issue. No one's walking around Alphington going, oh, we've got to chop population, or no one's walking around North Fitzroy saying that, because they're getting extra schools, they're getting extra childcare, they're getting extra sports facilities. They didn't get that at South Bank, they didn't get that at Docklands, and therefore people will raise these type of issues that are reflected in that question.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Steve. That's all? Okay. Now, this is a rather thrilling question. It comes via Paula Gray from the Hills Common Alliance. And where are the people from Olinda? Would they like to just stand up? And they've come all the way from Olinda today to our meeting. Thank you very, very much. And this question, we understand that the current Labor state government, Parks Victoria, has recently initiated a policy of handing over wherever possible Crown land to local government for management. Will the Liberal government overrule the Labor government's decision to allow Parks Victoria to destroy our beautiful community parkland in Olinda? In particular, would the Liberal Party acknowledge the poor community consultation and extensive community objection and immediately halt the development of the Olinda precinct plan?
Well, what we will do is we will sit down and actually work through where that process is at the moment. I must say, I get very nervous when I see parkland being handed over to any other interest other than, community access in some way. And having more population, as I said earlier, means to me more need for open space, more need for parkland, not a need for less. So, well, as John just reminds me, we just made a very significant commitment, I think, at the St Kilda Triangle, that area will be absolutely park, it will be open space, and that will make a huge commitment. So our tendency is to make sure that there is more open space given the enormous population, and I'm happy to sit down, if elected, and work through that with you.
Okay. Thank you. And I think because that was a very specific question to you, we shall move on. Now this again, and I'm sorry, but this is just the way it happens. This again is from Rosemary West. It will touch on many of your concerns. And this is to David Davis and one of the Greens representatives. Will your party commit to curbing inappropriate overdevelopment in the green wedges by limiting the development of buildings and impermeable surfaces, e.g. roads, to 2,000 square metres or 20% of a green wedge sale?
Well, I'm not going to answer in a precise number because I'm not sure of the exact how the numbers work there. I understand the point that Rosemary's making, and she's made that, for example, at council briefings that I've been present at, and I think this, in part, if I'm not wrong, tell me if I'm wrong on this, relates to a concern about the large road construction that's occurring in that area. Now that is supported by my party. I think it's supported by the Labor Party as well. Within that context, I mean, I'm always happy to work with people to try and minimise that impact. I'm not happy to say that we won't build that. I think it's about the road as much as anything. No. Oh, okay, all right.
Okay, we'll move on, but we will move on.
But I think that's the general answer.
All right.
Did you want to answer? Look, we haven't supported the North East Link. We don't support those kinds of huge new toll roads, particularly the ones that are not coming out of a comprehensive transport plan, that aren't looking at public transport and everything else that we need. So understand that that's what's causing a lot of the problems, and it will take up a huge amount of parkland and very important space. And so we don't support the North East Link, and we have put out there our policy for protecting the green wedges as well, which has some more detail on the website. I don't know the exact numbers, but absolutely don't support the North East Link. And I just also wanted to say that we also announced a plan a couple of days ago around a windfall developers tax. So for too long in this town and across Victoria, when land is rezoned, developers can make windfall profits, and often they're putting pressure on planning ministers to rezone land, and then they make huge profits, and we're talking tens to hundreds of times what they paid for that land. In other jurisdictions, they have to pay tax on that, and that's our policy, is where developers make a huge windfall, they have to give a very large chunk of that back to the community, and that will help to reduce land speculation and land banking as well, which is what's causing a lot of the problems in this town.
All right. Now, no other comments? All right, we'll move on now to transport. And this is... It's not a Dorothy Dixer, I want to tell you that now. This is from William McDougall. I'll direct it first to Steve Jolly. Why do both major parties make large unfunded and untested transport infrastructure promises before each election?
Because they're the human equivalent of grizzly bears who sleep during the winter and then wake up in the summer. Most of them you don't see until election time. It actually is a Dorothy Dixer, but I didn't know it was coming. Look, I mean, I think it's just no-brainer. I mean, the article by Clay Lucas a few days ago in The Age, there's so many Melburnians, and I work in the building industry, we're building suburbs where people don't have access to trams, like you forget about that, but trains or a bus that basically takes people to the bingo, but it isn't in any way integrated with the railway system. You've got, everybody agrees, for example, just one example, the 86 tram needs to be extended from Bundura, RMIT, well, yeah, that's true, to South Morang. I mean, how can we talk about planning when we've got 16, you know, the city of Whittlesea has got the fastest growing area in Melbourne, it's the fastest growing city on the continent, and we're still having an argument about extending a single tram line north, never mind the train line. This is stuff we shouldn't even be debating. I mean, the fact that you've got a socialist having to say, let's have some planning here. I'm supposed to be the crazy one, you know, like, I mean, then anyway, I'll leave it at that.
There's that quote from Cuomo, who's the old, very grizzly, I think, New York governor, who says that you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. In Victoria, we campaign and promise public transport, but what we get is tollways when we're actually in the period of government. And I mean, I have to say, generally, one of the things you do as a politician, I'm sure you get better at it when you're actually elected, is you pretend you have the answers to things all the time. I really struggle to answer the question why we don't have the public transport we want, because it's not like the community doesn't want it. It's not like the evidence doesn't direct us there. But what we're seeing, I think, is a couple of things that partly relate to what I mentioned earlier. One, we have seen this privatisation of planning. So Transurban goes to the government with a plan for a tollway in the west. It's never been on anyone's radar. It gets funded. You know, we're increasingly seeing that. The example this morning of a report of, a planning minister who had the chance to transform Melbourne when he was minister, now as an author of a report saying the north is in big trouble and his solution, again, is lots of roads. And I think what you're seeing is industry-led answers, and the solution is to stop the revolving door, but actually to change the politicians so you have public transport committed people.
I'm going to have to disagree on some of this. I think it is a good thing to have some thoughtful long-term planning. We actually do need that, and we've supported the role of Infrastructure Victoria to do some of that work. But it is important when parties come to an election that their policies are carefully costed, that there is actually the background work done there, and all of the policies that we have brought forward at this election are costed. They are actually policies that we've worked through. So if you talk about transport extensions in the case of Baxter and Clyde, and the duplication of the Greensboro to Eltham corridors so that we can actually move more trains down that corridor, the regional fast rail that we've announced, you know, we've actually put all of those, they have all been worked through, and that is part of the work that is actually done in that long period in opposition, I might say, where you work through the detail with stakeholder groups and with those. I have a small panel of engineers and others who have helped me with a lot of the transport projects, including the European-style fast rail. I have a panel of about 8 who are very smart people, some of them ex-bureaucrats, who sit down with me and they work out, you know, how do you get fast to Geelong in 32 minutes? Well, there is detail on that you actually need to do and cost. You can't just, you know, in my view, you can't make nebulous promises. Labor has drawn a kind of a loop round the city and said, oh, well, we'll do that. Well, it's $100 billion later. You've got to actually do the work, and, you know, you've got to actually do the costings. It may be tiresome, it may be slow, and people might like us to do things more quickly, but, you know, we do have a responsibility, because it is taxpayers' money, and we can't just squander it on bad projects. I mean, something like the level crossing removal project, it's a good project, the idea of removing level crossings, but even good projects have got to be run in budget. So the costings initially sub $5 billion are now, it's now skating well over $8 billion. It's more than 65% over budget. I mean, the truth is that badly managed projects, badly costed projects lead to less good projects, not more.
Thank you. All right, thank you. Now we're going to move on to one of the core issues, which is VCAT. And I have a question here from Dasha Kopacek of the City of Whitehorse. She's a resident. There are a number of current injustices caused by VCAT processes and systems, including inequitable operations and decision-making arising in VCAT, and often tied to and caused by a number of matters, including over or inappropriate development, poor building appropriate development, poor building design outcomes and materials issue, a lack of population controls, a system and rules which favour developers, predominantly overseas developers, and a system which presently lacks or seeks to cut out community consultation, and one we've added in after this discussion, increasing VCAT fees. So I think this should be a general discussion. This has been at the heart of much of my ulcer over the years. So would anybody like to... Yes, of course, your Shadow Attorney General, solve this problem.
Don't worry, Rod, I don't charge anymore. I'm out of practice. Thanks, Dash. I don't know if Dash is here today. Thank you, Dasha, for your question. Yeah, look, I'd echo what I said earlier, that there are layers upon layers of problems with the way communities and residents groups can interact with VCAT. We're certainly looking to make further announcements in the course of the campaign to, as I said, improve access in the first place, which is about fees. To what extent can we deal with that question to improve better access to VCAT in the first place without people being either monstered out of bringing applications before VCAT or just being generally deterred because of the fees themselves. And that's in addition to the question of legal costs. It comes down to what I said before, was the calibration you strike as a question of policy. Do you really believe in local democracy? Decode that to mean, does local planning policy mean anything? And if it does, then you'd be a big tick for local democracy. And then how does that interact with state planning policy? And I don't think that balance is necessarily right now. And I'm convinced from all the many discussions, I know David's had some too, and we've had lots of discussions about how we might approach this problem to make sure that we can place a greater premium on local planning policy. The other problem, which I think you've identified in some of your preamble remarks and your question, Dasha, is you get a great variation across the system in what decisions VCAT is producing. And I think anybody who goes before VCAT, no matter what municipality you hail from, you should be able to look at the system and say, well, where's the consistency of decision making across the board? And I think one of the best ways to achieve that greater consistency is to recalibrate that balance between community voices. Now, again, this is not a political event, but I will make the point, if you'll forgive me, that the government came in and claimed that it was going to give a greater voice to communities, and that attention would have to be given in VCAT matters to the number of people objecting. Well, I've spoken to so many groups who believe that came to nothing. And so we need something more substantive about actually how we give that voice real sound in the system. So, as I said before, I think I'm on the same page with so many of you on this, as is David. Ellen, I'm not sure if you want to say.
And what about fees?
I made the point at the start that we're happy to look, as part of the process, we're going to be looking at access to VCAT and what deterrents are in place and how we can address those, and fees will be very much a part of that process.
Kathleen?
How many people here have been to VCAT? How many people have won? Okay, a lot of walking wounded and a few people who survived. But it's a David and Goliath battle at VCAT, isn't it? Except you don't have a slingshot and they've cleared the stones away. And VCAT was supposed to be a review body and an accessible, affordable place to get justice, and we want to take it back to that. So we want to go back to VCAT, or take VCAT back to being a review body where there's been a mistake, an error, it goes to VCAT, but not where it's not just even a second go, but sometimes the first go. We trust councils. Councils get things wrong. Steve and I have been councillors. We know we get things wrong, but in a democratic process, you have checks and balances. That's what VCAT is. It shouldn't be a decision-making body. And we think if we go back and make those changes, then you look at things like the cost, the process, because there's the fees, but there's also the thing about, can you afford the $10,000 a day QC that the other side is going to have, because they know they'll get it back when they flog their apartments. So VCAT needs a lot of work, and we're committed to doing that.
The VCAT process is totally toxic. At the very smallest level, if you win at IDAC, if you lose at IDAC and you're an objector, If you lose at the planning tribunal at a council, it's called IDAC in Yarra, I'm not sure what it is in other councils, you get 21 days to appeal. If you're a developer and you lose, you get 60 days to appeal. I mean, just this is a little minor thing that could be fixed with a stroke of a pen. The second thing is this unrealistic, and I'm the last person, if any of you know me, I'm the last person to defend the Yarra Planning Department, but it's totally unrealistic with this orgy of development that we've got in Yarra and elsewhere to have a 60-day limit that the developer can just run off to VCAT after 60 days. It's totally unreasonable. It's not fair on any planning department, especially under-resourced planning departments. Also, if Kathleen loses the election and she doesn't like the result, just because she doesn't like the result, she can't go off to the VEC and ask for inquiry. She can only ask for inquiry if she thinks there's been something dodgy. If I get accused of murder and get found guilty of murder and I go, well, I don't fancy spending the rest of my life in jail, I want to go and have an appeal. No, there has to be an error in law. You can't just go off to VEC or AEC and ask for a recount just because you feel like it. But this is what you can do at the local level. Developers just, well, we don't like what the council did, we're running off to VCAT. And the last thing I'll say, and I don't want to be here defending tribunal members, but we also have to understand that even good tribunal members at VCAT are working to a state planning scheme, and they're looking at the local planning scheme. So, you know, they're limited by that too. So that you can't just look at VCAT in isolation from the reform of the state and local planning scheme. Sorry, yeah.
I don't know where it's gone. The last point you made, I think, is absolutely right. Having greater certainty and greater clarity in the planning system will actually reduce the capacity for the uncertainty and the decision-making to be contested. And, you know, we need more of that predictability and certainty. And and that was the story of mandatory height limits, for example, before.
In the Assembly, it was never ever proceeded with in the Council, so when the Parliament finishes in a couple of days' time, it will lapse. The point I made then was that we needed genuine public consultation, both on what was there in the bill and the elements that were not in the bill, and that at the time the intention was to send it off to a committee of the Legislative Council. It could easily be some other form of or structure in order to open up the debate and get genuine public input. My view is there's been lots of good work done on that bill, but there's a hell of a lot about it that needs to be looked at seriously by the community. The issues that have been raised this afternoon, I'm entirely open to having that discussion in the context of that bill.
And just could I add to that, Rod?
Yes.
The Voting Rights in the City of Melbourne Act are so undemocratic, it is outrageous. They absolutely need to change. It should be one vote, one value. That is the fundamental principle of democracy that our society is based on. So why doesn't that exist in the City of Melbourne? And now we've seen places like Sydney trying to adopt these measures to give businesses 2 votes to residents once, to try and kick out Clover Moore because she's been such an effective and progressive independent mayor in Sydney. So it is very, very dangerous what we have here in Melbourne, which does not allow for one vote, one value. And I've called on both parties to support changing it many, many times. Haven't been successful so far, but it has to absolutely change, and there is absolutely community support for it to change.
Thank you. Yep. Sorry, I will have. Do you have an answer?
What I said was there are many things that should have been addressed. There are many things that should have been addressed in the review of the Local Government Act, including the City of Melbourne stuff, including the rating structure, including accountability, including probably 200 or 300 issues that were not. What I said was we need to open it up again so that those issues are addressed.
Okay. All right, we are at the end of our time. Just to let you know, we have far more questions than we had time to put to our panel today. These panels, just a moment, you had something to say? Oh yes, please do.
Thank you for the question. Obviously, the law that's in place and the scheme that's in place is one that Labor has put in place. But something that I've been really passionate about since I've been in public life is making sure that I advocate for the wishes of the people who I represent. And in this case, if I am successful in being the member for Melbourne, making sure that those wishes that I know are very deeply held by people in Melbourne are represented.
And what's your
answer? So I thought my answer was pretty clear in that
Will you support or propose it? That it reverts to one resident,
all right.
one landowner equals one vote?
It's not something I can answer with yes or no. It's something.
Well, no, politics... all right. Okay, well, look, we'll leave it at that. And I am very sorry we had... hello, Kristen. How are you? Sorry? All right, look, I know everybody's got a question that hasn't been asked and they need it to be asked. Non-inclusion on local heritage overlays. If your party wins government, what action will your government take to prevent this from continuing to occur? So that will be broadly our last question. It's a question about something that we're all proud of in Victoria, that we used to have an awful lot of and have a substantially less of, and every day I see it go. So what's the answer, boys and girls?
I'm happy to answer that, and I did meet with the National Trust and talk about some of these issues recently, and I think your current journal, I'm not sure if the hard copy edition is published yet. I haven't seen the hard copy, but there's actually some points about heritage in that article that I've submitted to your journal, and we make the commitment to begin a broad review on heritage because it's very clear that our heritage protections are too weak. They're much too weak, and I could go through many local examples, whether it be shopping centres or individual properties, or be the huge strip of trees down St Kilda Road that have been lost because of, frankly, a weak heritage approach by Heritage Victoria. And I think we need to review that directly. Now, what I would also say in terms of the financial resources to assist councils, we will do that review, and one of the things I will ask, if I'm honoured to be in the position, I will ask that review to look at what financial resources are needed, because I accept that more financial resources are needed by councils. We're also focused on the restoration of the rural flying squads, and I particularly have made sure that there will be funding if we're elected for those, because they will assist with a whole series of planning issues in country Victoria, regional Victoria, where we're actually, many of the councils are financially challenged and unable to do some of that work. So in essence, I'm saying I'm very interested to find a way to make sure there's proper funding, but within a proper structure that will protect heritage into the future.
Thank you for your question. Heritage absolutely needs more time to talk about. Yes, that sounds like a wonderful idea, because at the moment we're having to see residents groups and local heritage groups fight so hard to protect heritage, often sometimes against councils, often against the minister. I have been very passionate about heritage over the last 4 years. I've run campaigns on so many buildings that unfortunately we lost. We lost the Palace Theatre, we lost the Princess Mary Club, we lost 488 La Trobe. There's other buildings that we've been campaigning on, and it's just devastating when you run that long campaign. I can't imagine what it's like for local groups as well, to just run such a long campaign and then just to see it demolished because it didn't have protection or the minister didn't step in. The Corkman, yes, but that was a slightly different matter. That wasn't a situation where we called for the minister to step in and he didn't, which has happened in a lot of cases. I know that Greens councillor Rohan Leppard at the City of Melbourne just instigated a huge review, the biggest review we've seen in years and years of all the heritage in inner city Melbourne, and that's just seen the minister actually put some more important properties on the Heritage Register, great, but that had to be led by Rohan, pushed on by the local community and local heritage groups who'd been agitating it for so long. So it's always having to come from the grassroots up, rather than having a minister or a government who's actually caring about it and saying, let's do the work now to map it, let's do the work to figure out what needs to be protected, rather than relying on little groups to kind of pick individual buildings and fight tooth and nail to try and protect them.
At the end of the last council election in Yarra, the resident groups fired up and said we want a heritage advisor at Yarra. It's actually pretty bizarre that there wasn't actually a full-time in-house heritage advisor. We had a win there. We've got a heritage advisor at Yarra. She's very good, but that's the problem is no one's listening to her. The planning department are not mandated to have to listen and act on what the heritage advisor is saying. We've just had a situation with the ACU, the Australian Catholic University, right now actually. It's a live issue in South Fitzroy, just running roughshod over heritage buildings in that area. The planning department been acquiescent to changes that they've requested at VCAT, and we had to, as councillors, come over their head at the last council meeting and pull them in line. So, yeah, I'm all for heritage advisors, and we've, as I say, we've taken on one of the best around at Yarra recently, but it doesn't really mean much if no one has to listen to them.
Often it's the planning minister overrides it, or the council's asked the planning minister to step in and the planning minister doesn't do it. So not every council is good, absolutely, but often it's also the planning minister that's to blame.
All right.
That is why I want a proper review, so that we can actually look at the whole system. Heritage Victoria is too weak. The ability to intervene is too unclear. Councils vary a lot. You know, there's a lot of problems. I accept the point that more resources are needed to give councils the capacity to protect their own local areas.
Right. Now, we will have to stop it there. Before I thank each of our speakers, I'll go back to what I was about to say. All the questions that you've submitted either in writing today or online prior to the meeting will be collated, and then they will be sent to each of our panellists and distributed more widely. So keep up the pressure. You would have noticed we have cameras here today. This panel discussion will go online, so you and your groups can watch it. But you're all here because you care deeply about the quality of the life in Melbourne that you see being eaten away on a daily basis. So keep up the pressure. There's been a lot of promises made by people here today. Some of them will be in a position to act upon those promises, so keep them to it. There's video now, so you can hold them to it. Every day I see Donald Trump say one thing, and juxtaposed against it is a thing he said the week before, diametrically opposed to what he said right now. So it's there for all to see. Hold them accountable, keep the pressure up. This is a wonderful city. It's one I was born in. I'm fifth generation Melbourne. I was there when we took the land from the Aboriginals and instigated the first planning scheme. The Quantocks were there. It's all my fault. So please thank David and John and David and Alan and Kathleen and Steve and Bea, who arrived late on the scene, and in their absence, Dick Wynne. And particularly thank you to Michael Buxton, who is just ubiquitous in his support of our city. And I can't name all the people who've held this together, but Mary and Margaret really have done fantastic work. It's really been great to have you all here. Not as many as we would have liked, but we've got the best people, not necessarily the most people. So go back to your groups. You've got a couple of weeks left to make all the changes you need to make, and hopefully we'll see you again in 4 years when we ask the same questions again. Thank you so much. Good on you. Thank you very much. Good on you.